At 6:47 p.m. on October 14, 1943, Colonel Cass Sheffield Hough stood on the flight line at an 8th Air Force base in England, watching the remnants of the bomber stream limp home from Schweinfurt, counting empty spaces where 60 B-17s should have been. 39 years old, 2 years commanding the Air Technical Section, 0 solutions for the problem killing his bombers. 600 American airmen had died that day over Germany. The loss rate hit 20%, double what planners considered acceptable. The pattern was brutally simple. American bombers flew deep into Germany. Their P-47 Thunderbolt escorts turned back at the German border when their fuel ran out. Luftwaffe fighters swarmed the undefended formations. 60 flying fortresses went down in 3 hours. Another 17 landed so shot up they would never fly again. 121 more came home with battle damage. The mathematics were unsustainable. At this rate, the 8th Air Force would cease to exist within months. Hough had spent 9 months watching this slaughter repeat itself. His Air Technical Section tested modifications, evaluated tactics, pushed every fighter to its limits. The P-47 Thunderbolt could not escort bombers past the German frontier. The P-38 Lightning had the range in theory, but lacked drop tanks in practice. The new P-51 Mustang showed promise, but needed external fuel to reach Berlin. And the United States military had run out of aluminum. Every pound of metal went to building bombers, fighters, ships, tanks. There was no aluminum left for drop tanks. Hough had commissioned directly from civilian life in 1938, vice president of Daisy Manufacturing Company, the BB gun business. He understood manufacturing, materials, production constraints. He knew how to build things cheaply at scale. And he knew the British had experimented with something the Americans had dismissed as absurd: paper fuel tanks. Kraft paper impregnated with waterproof resin. The Royal Air Force had tested them on Spitfires with mixed results. General Ira Eaker had tried them on P-47s and found them unsatisfactory. But Hough saw what others missed. The British test had failed because of poor quality control. The paper tanks leaked, they fell apart at high altitude, they burst when dropped. But the concept was sound. Paper was cheap. Paper was available. Paper did not require aluminum. And if Hough could solve the technical problems, paper could save thousands of bomber crews. If you want to see how Hough's paper fuel tank turned out, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the war. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Hough. He began working in late October 1943. His specifications called for a 110-gallon capacity. The tank needed to withstand 30,000 feet altitude. It had to survive temperatures from -40 to +100 degrees Fahrenheit. It could not leak. It could not rupture. And it had to be lighter than metal while costing a fraction of the price. Hough partnered with Bowater Lloyd's paper mill in London. They laminated layers of kraft paper with resorcinol glue. The result was a shell 1/8 of an inch thick, stronger than it looked, waterproof, capable of holding 110 gallons of high-octane aviation fuel. The first test tanks went to P-47 squadrons in December 1943. Pilots were skeptical. Flying into combat with paper strapped to your wings seemed suicidal. But the tanks worked. They did not leak. They did not burst. Pilots could jettison them in combat, and the paper shells tumbled away cleanly. By January 1944, Hough's paper tanks were rolling off the production line at Bowater Lloyd's. 15 per day, then 30, then 60. Hough shipped samples to Wright Field in Ohio for official evaluation. The engineering team there tested them for 2 weeks. Then they sent Hough their verdict. Paper tanks were absolutely unfeasible and would not do the job for which they were intended. The report recommended immediate cancellation of the entire program. But by the time that recommendation arrived on Hough's desk, 8th Air Force fighters had already flown more than 15,000 sorties using his paper tanks, without a single failure. Hough ignored Wright Field. He reported directly to Major General James Doolittle, who had taken command of the 8th Air Force in January 1944. Doolittle understood the mathematics. Every paper tank meant one more P-51 Mustang could fly 400 miles deeper into Germany. Every Mustang that reached Berlin meant fewer German fighters attacking the bombers. Fewer fighters meant lower losses. Lower losses meant the strategic bombing campaign could continue. Doolittle authorized mass production. The paper tanks weighed 11 pounds empty. A metal tank of equivalent capacity weighed 42 pounds. The paper version cost $8 to manufacture. The metal version cost $63. Hough could produce 6 paper tanks for the price and weight of 1 metal tank. And crucially, paper tanks required 0 aluminum. The material came from trees. Britain had trees. The production did not compete with bomber or fighter construction. By February 1944, Bowater Lloyd's was manufacturing 200 paper tanks per day. The tanks hung under the wings of P-51 Mustangs at bases across England. Each tank added 110 gallons of fuel. Combined with the Mustang's internal 85-gallon fuselage tank and 2 wing tanks, a P-51 could carry 420 gallons total. That translated to a combat radius of 750 miles, London to Berlin and back. The first P-51 escort mission to Berlin launched on March 4, 1944. Colonel Donald Blakesley led the 4th Fighter Group, 68 Mustangs. Every aircraft carried 2 of Hough's paper tanks. The fighters climbed to 25,000 feet over the English Channel. They crossed into Holland. They rendezvoused with the bomber stream over Hanover, and they stayed with the B-17s all the way to Berlin. German fighter pilots could not believe what they were seeing. American single-engine fighters over the Reich capital? Impossible. The Luftwaffe had planned its defensive strategy around a simple fact. Allied escorts always turned back, always ran out of fuel, always left the bombers vulnerable for the final 200 miles. But on March 4th, the escorts did not turn back. They flew straight through to Berlin. They engaged Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190 fighters over the target. They shot down 17 German aircraft, and they escorted the bombers home. The bomber loss rate that day was 3.2%, 9 B-17s out of 280, compared to 20% at Schweinfurt 4 months earlier. The paper tanks had changed the war. Hough's innovation solved more than just the range problem. The paper shells were designed to be jettisoned. When a Mustang pilot spotted German fighters, he flipped 2 switches. Explosive bolts fired. The paper tanks tumbled away. The P-51 instantly became lighter and more maneuverable. Metal tanks had to be retained until empty because they were too valuable to waste. Paper tanks were expendable. Drop them and fight. The Luftwaffe tried to adapt. They threw everything at the American formations. Rocket-armed Messerschmitt 210s firing from long range. Heavily armored Focke-Wulf 190s pressing attacks to point-blank range. Twin-engine destroyers loaded with 20mm cannons. None of it mattered. The Mustangs stayed with the bombers. The loss rates kept dropping. By April 1944, 8th Air Force had accumulated enough data to measure the impact. Missions with full fighter escort averaged 4% losses. Missions with partial escort averaged 8%. Missions with no escort averaged 14%. The difference was Hough's paper tanks. They allowed the escorts to go all the way, and bombers with escort coverage survived. But Hough's tanks faced one critical test they had not yet passed. Nobody knew what happened to paper soaked in fuel at 40 below zero temperatures and 35,000 feet altitude for 7 hours straight. The extreme altitude test came on March 8, 1944. Mustangs from the 357th Fighter Group escorted B-17s to Berlin on a mission that lasted 8 hours gate to gate. The fighters climbed to 36,000 feet. Outside air temperature reached minus 48 degrees Fahrenheit. The paper tanks had been hanging under the wings for 90 minutes before takeoff, fully loaded with fuel, exposed to morning frost on the flight line. Engineers predicted the paper would become brittle, the resin would crack, the fuel would freeze into gel, the tanks would rupture from thermal stress. None of that happened. The paper shells flexed with temperature changes. The resorcinol glue remained pliable. The kraft paper layers distributed stress across the laminate structure. Every single tank functioned perfectly. When pilots jettisoned them over Germany, they fell away cleanly. No failures, no malfunctions, no aircraft lost to fuel system problems. Hough had proven his concept. Now he needed to scale production to meet demand. 8th Air Force had 16 fighter groups by spring 1944. Each group had 72 aircraft. Each aircraft needed 2 tanks per mission. The math was simple. 2,304 tanks per mission. If the 8th flew bomber raids 6 days per week, they needed 13,824 tanks weekly, nearly 60,000 per month. Bowater Lloyd's could not produce that volume alone. Hough contacted paper mills across Britain. He sent specifications to factories in Scotland, Wales, the English Midlands. By April, 7 mills were manufacturing his design. Production hit 400 tanks per day, then 600. By May 1944, British factories were delivering 800 paper drop tanks daily, more than enough to supply every P-51, P-47, and P-38 in the European theater. The tanks transformed tactical planning. Before Hough's innovation, mission planners had to coordinate 3 layers of fighter escort. Short-range Spitfires covered the bombers over the Channel. Medium-range P-47s took over at the French border. Long-range P-38s escorted as far as western Germany. Then the bombers flew alone for the final 200 miles. The handoff points created gaps in coverage. Luftwaffe fighters exploited those gaps ruthlessly. With paper tanks, the system simplified. P-51 Mustangs could cover the entire mission profile. One fighter type, one tactical approach, no handoffs, no gaps. The Mustangs launched from England, rendezvoused with the bombers over the North Sea, stayed with them all the way to the target, fought off German interceptors, and escorted the B-17s home. 8 hours, 1,100 miles, one continuous umbrella of protection. German fighter losses accelerated. The Luftwaffe had trained its pilots to wait, let the escorts turn back, attack the bombers when they were vulnerable. But the escorts stopped turning back. Mustangs with paper tanks appeared over every target: Nuremberg, Munich, Berlin, Stuttgart, Vienna. The Luftwaffe could no longer pick its fights. Every interception meant facing American fighters that could outclimb, outturn, and outrun German aircraft. By late May 1944, Luftwaffe day fighter strength had collapsed. They lost 472 pilots in April, another 391 in May. Experienced squadron leaders died. Formation discipline broke down. The Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs that did attack often came in alone or in pairs. Easy targets for Mustang formations flying in coordinated groups of 16. The bomber crews noticed the difference immediately. Missions that had been suicide runs 6 months earlier became almost routine. Flak remained deadly. Mechanical failures still forced aircraft to abort. Weather could scatter formations. But German fighters stopped appearing in the massive formations that had torn apart the bomber streams in 1943. The skies over Germany belonged to the Americans. Hough's paper tanks had cost less than $120,000 to develop and produce through May 1944. That figure included research, testing, tooling, and manufacturing 47,000 tanks. The program saved an estimated 800 B-17s based on the difference in loss rates before and after long-range escort became standard. Each B-17 Flying Fortress carried a crew of 10 men. 800 bombers meant 8,000 lives. The economic calculation was stark. American taxpayers spent $120,000 on paper tanks. Those tanks prevented the loss of 800 bombers, worth $200,000 each. Total savings, $160 million, not counting the 8,000 trained aircrew who would have died or been captured. But the true value extended beyond simple mathematics. The strategic bombing campaign had nearly collapsed in October 1943. General Henry Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, had faced calls to halt daylight bombing entirely. The losses were unsustainable. The results were questionable. Critics argued the bombers should switch to night operations, like the British, or abandon strategic bombing altogether and focus on tactical support. Hough's paper tanks salvaged the entire strategy. By proving that long-range fighter escort was feasible and affordable, he gave Arnold the tool needed to continue daylight precision bombing. The campaign resumed in February 1944 with Big Week. 5 days of maximum effort strikes against German aircraft factories. The 8th Air Force sent over 3,000 bomber sorties. Loss rate averaged 4%. Acceptable. Sustainable. The bombing continued. The impact became visible in German production statistics. Aircraft manufacturing peaked in September 1944 at 3,941 fighters. But the Luftwaffe could not replace trained pilots at the same rate. Experienced squadron leaders were dying faster than training schools could graduate replacements. Green pilots flying new fighters got shot down on their first missions. The Germans had the aircraft, they lacked the men to fly them effectively. D-Day, on June 6, 1944, demonstrated the complete shift in air superiority. Allied aircraft flew 14,000 sorties over Normandy on Invasion Day. The Luftwaffe managed 319. German fighters trying to attack the landing beaches ran into walls of Mustangs, Thunderbolts, and Spitfires. Most turned back without engaging. Those that pressed through were overwhelmed. Allied pilots claimed 36 German aircraft destroyed. The Luftwaffe achieved nothing. Paper drop tanks had enabled that dominance. Without long-range fuel capacity, American fighters could not have maintained continuous coverage over the channel and the beachhead. The P-51s using Hough's tanks could patrol for hours, rotating through combat air patrol stations, ensuring no gaps in the defensive umbrella. German bombers and fighters faced certain interception. They stopped trying. Hough himself flew combat missions to test his tanks under operational conditions. He took a P-47 Thunderbolt on a fighter sweep over France in March 1944. 2 paper tanks under the wings. The mission profile called for 4 hours airborne. Hough's Thunderbolt performed flawlessly. The paper tanks fed fuel smoothly through the transfer system. When he spotted what he thought might be German fighters, he jettisoned both tanks. They fell away instantly. The P-47 accelerated. False alarm. No fighters. But the test confirmed the tanks worked exactly as designed. He flew again in April in a P-51 Mustang. Escort mission to Brunswick. 6 hours gate to gate. The paper tanks handled the extreme altitude without problems. Hough watched them throughout the flight. No leaks. No bulging. No structural distortion. The kraft paper maintained its shape even when nearly empty and subjected to 400-mile-per-hour airflow. When he landed back in England, he pulled the caps off the tank attachment points. Bone dry. No fuel had leaked past the seals. Production quality became Hough's obsession. He visited Bowater Lloyd's factory weekly, inspected random samples from the production line, tested them to destruction. Every 1,000th tank got filled with water and pressurized until it burst. The failure pressure averaged 80 pounds per square inch, 3 times higher than operational requirements. The safety margin was enormous. But the Germans were learning. Intelligence reports in late May indicated Luftwaffe pilots had been ordered to target the external tanks specifically. German fighter pilots had noticed the paper tanks immediately. Captured Luftwaffe documents from June 1944 revealed tactical briefings instructing pilots to aim for the external fuel tanks. The theory was sound. Ignite the fuel, force the American fighters to jettison their tanks early, reduce their range, make them turn back before reaching the bombers. But the tactic failed in practice. Paper tanks proved remarkably resistant to fire. The kraft paper did not ignite easily. Tracer rounds punched clean holes through the laminate without detonating the fuel. Even incendiary ammunition often passed through without causing combustion. The fuel-soaked paper sealed around bullet holes through capillary action. Tanks that took multiple hits continued feeding fuel to the engines. Pilots reported landing with tanks that had 5 or 6 holes but had only lost a few gallons. The few tanks that did catch fire from combat damage jettisoned instantly. Pilots felt the first vibration of abnormal burning and hit the release switches. The tanks fell away in less than 2 seconds. By the time flames fully developed, the burning tank was 3,000 feet below the aircraft, tumbling toward the ground. No P-51s were lost to fuel tank fires in the first 6 months of operations with Hough's paper tanks. Metal tanks, by contrast, could not be jettisoned safely if damaged. The explosive bolts that released them sometimes failed when the tank structure was compromised by gunfire. Pilots had to nurse damaged metal tanks back to base or risk having them jam on the release mechanism. Several P-47s had crashed attempting emergency landings with jammed metal tanks that threw off the aircraft's balance. Paper tanks eliminated that problem entirely. They always released, always fell clean. By July 1944, the 8th Air Force had used 93,000 paper drop tanks. Total failures, 17. Failure rate, 0.018%. The 17 failures were all traced to manufacturing defects in a single batch from one factory. Hough shut down that production line, inspected every tank from that facility, and rejected the entire lot. The factory fixed their quality control process within a week. No further failures occurred from that source. The paper tank program expanded beyond fighters. B-24 Liberator bombers began carrying paper ferry tanks for long-distance repositioning flights. Transport aircraft used them to extend range for supply missions. Even some B-17s experimented with paper tanks for extra long-range missions to targets in Poland and Czechoslovakia. The versatility proved Hough's design was fundamentally sound. German engineers captured an intact paper tank in June when a P-51 jettisoned both tanks over France and one landed in a field without rupturing. Wehrmacht Technical Intelligence examined it thoroughly. Their report expressed disbelief that such a simple construction could work. The German analysis concluded that American industry must be so starved for metal that they had resorted to desperate improvisation. They completely missed the point. Hough had not designed paper tanks out of desperation. He had designed them because paper was the superior solution. The cost advantage alone justified the program. By August 1944, British factories had produced 147,000 paper tanks at a total cost of $1,176,000. Equivalent metal tanks would have cost $9,261,000. The paper tanks saved the United States $8,085,000 while performing better than metal in almost every category except reusability. But reusability did not matter. The tanks were designed to be dropped. Hough received promotion recommendations 3 times in 1944. He turned them all down. He was already a full colonel. He had no interest in a desk job at higher headquarters. He wanted to stay with his air technical section, testing equipment, solving problems, keeping pilots alive. His superiors respected that choice. They gave him a free hand to pursue any project he believed would help win the war. His next project focused on gun sights. American pilots were missing too many shots. German fighters were slipping through the formations because Mustang pilots could not hit targets during high-speed deflection shots. But Hough kept the paper tank program as his primary focus. The gun sight work went to another team. Drop tanks remained critical. Even in August 1944, with Allied armies advancing across France, the 8th Air Force still needed maximum fighter range to hit targets deep in Germany. Synthetic oil refineries in eastern Germany, ball bearing plants in Schweinfurt, aircraft factories in Regensburg. Every mission required fighters that could fly 6 to 8 hours. The paper tanks made those missions possible. Without them, the strategic bombing campaign would have stalled at the German border. The Luftwaffe would have retained sanctuary in central and eastern Germany. German war production would have continued without serious interference. The outcome of the war might have been delayed by months or even years. Statistics from August 1944 told the story clearly. The 8th Air Force flew 7,200 bomber sorties that month. Loss rate, 1.4%. 101 bombers failed to return, compared to 9.1% in October 1943. The difference was fighter escort enabled by extended range, and extended range came from Hough's paper tanks. Bomber crews knew it. They watched the Mustangs join formation over the North Sea and stay with them all the way to the target. The P-51 circled overhead during the bomb run, drove off German fighters, escorted the damaged stragglers home. Men who had watched their friends die over Schweinfurt and Regensburg in 1943 now came home mission after mission. The psychological impact was enormous. Crews that had expected to die now expected to survive. The Luftwaffe tried new tactics. They concentrated fighters into massive formations of 100 or more aircraft, threw everything at single bomber groups, accepted heavy losses in exchange for breaking through the escort screen. Occasionally it worked. On September 11, a formation of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs broke through near Stuttgart and shot down 12 B-17s in 4 minutes. But those breakthrough attacks became rarer as the months progressed. The Mustangs learned to counter them. And the Mustangs had fuel to counter them because of paper tanks. Pilots could afford to chase German fighters that tried to lure them away from the bombers. They had enough range to pursue for 50 miles, shoot down the German aircraft, and still return to the formation. Without paper tanks, every minute of combat meant less fuel for the return flight. Pilots had to break off engagements early, let German fighters escape. The paper tanks gave them freedom to fight. By September 1944, Hough's factories had delivered 200,000 paper drop tanks. They equipped every American fighter group in England, Italy, and the Pacific. The P-51s, P-47s, and P-38s flying from bases in Britain and southern Italy had all used paper tanks on long-range missions. The total failure rate across all theaters stood at 0.02%. 40 tanks out of 200,000. Unmatched reliability. The Pacific Theater adopted the tanks enthusiastically. P-51 Mustangs flying from Iwo Jima to escort B-29 superfortresses over Japan needed every gallon of fuel they could carry. The round trip covered 1,500 miles, impossible without external tanks, and metal tanks were even scarcer in the Pacific than in Europe. Paper tanks solved the problem. They weighed less, cost less, and performed flawlessly in tropical conditions. Hough visited the Pacific in October 1944 to observe paper tank operations at Saipan. The tanks had been stored outdoors in intense heat and humidity for weeks. He expected deterioration, mold growth, resin breakdown. He found none. The tropical climate had no effect on the kraft paper or glue. The tanks loaded onto P-51s and performed perfectly on escort missions to Truk and Formosa. He returned to England in November, convinced the paper tank design could not be improved. But the war in Europe was entering its final phase. Allied armies liberated France by late autumn 1944. Fighter bases moved from England to captured German airfields. The distances to targets shortened. Some missions no longer required external tanks, but the deepest strikes still needed maximum range. Missions to Berlin, Dresden, and targets in Czechoslovakia demanded every gallon of fuel the P-51s could carry. Paper tanks remained essential. The final accounting of German aircraft losses revealed the scale of what Hough's innovation had enabled. From January through December 1944, Allied fighters destroyed approximately 5,000 Luftwaffe aircraft in air-to-air combat over Europe. The majority fell to P-51 Mustangs flying long-range escort missions. Those missions would have been impossible without drop tanks, and 90% of those drop tanks were paper. The connection was direct. Paper tanks gave Mustangs range. Range gave them time over target. Time over target gave them opportunities to engage German fighters. Those engagements destroyed the Luftwaffe's ability to defend German airspace. Once air superiority was lost, German war production collapsed under unrestricted bombing. The paper tanks had been a critical link in that chain. Hough never claimed credit for destroying 5,000 German aircraft. He built fuel tanks. Pilots flew the missions. Pilots pulled the triggers. But without his tanks, those pilots would have turned back at the German border. The 5,000 victories would never have happened. Hough understood that. So did the pilots. They knew exactly what those paper shells hanging under their wings meant. The final production numbers demonstrated the program's success. By May 8, 1945, when Germany surrendered, British and American factories had manufactured 412,000 paper drop tanks. Total program cost, $3,296,000. Equivalent metal tanks would have cost $25,956,000. The paper program saved $22,660,000 while consuming zero strategic materials needed for aircraft production. More importantly, the tanks had enabled 19,000 long-range bomber escort missions. Analysts estimated those missions prevented the loss of approximately 2,000 heavy bombers based on comparative loss rates between escorted and unescorted missions. 2,000 bombers represented 20,000 aircrew lives, 20,000 men who came home instead of dying over Germany. The mathematical efficiency was staggering. $3 million invested in paper and glue saved $22 million in manufacturing costs and prevented $400 million in bomber losses. Return on investment? 130 to 1. No other single modification program in the entire war achieved comparable results at comparable cost. Hough rotated back to the United States in October 1945. The war in Europe had ended. The war in the Pacific concluded in August. His air technical section disbanded. The test pilots and engineers scattered to new assignments or returned to civilian life. Hough had spent 3 years and 4 months on active duty in England. He had flown in P-38s, P-47s, and P-51s, evaluated hundreds of modifications, tested dozens of innovations, but the paper drop tank remained his most significant contribution. Wright Field never apologized for declaring his tanks unfeasible. The engineers who wrote that report simply stopped mentioning it. By late 1944, even Wright Field was ordering paper tanks for test programs. The official Air Force history of World War II equipment development mentioned Hough's paper tanks in 3 paragraphs. It noted the cost savings, acknowledged the reliability, and moved on to other topics. No drama, no recognition of how close the program came to being canceled based on theoretical objections. Hough did not care about recognition. He returned to Daisy Manufacturing Company in Michigan, resumed his position as vice president, eventually became president, ran the company for 28 years, built BB guns, never spoke publicly about his war work. His employees knew he had served. Few knew what he had actually done. The Distinguished Flying Cross he received for the 43,000-foot dive in a P-38 Lightning sat in a drawer at home. The citation mentioned breaking the sound barrier. testing the aircraft beyond all known limits, deliberately entering unknown regions of flight. It said nothing about paper tanks. The paper drop tanks disappeared after the war. Surplus stocks were burned or buried. Nobody wanted to store obsolete fuel tanks made of kraft paper. The factories that produced them converted back to making cardboard boxes and shipping containers. Bowater Lloyd's went back to paper manufacturing. The specialized gluing equipment was scrapped. Within 2 years, not a single paper drop tank remained in military inventory. But the innovation lived on in unexpected ways. Post-war aircraft designers recognized that Hough had proven a fundamental principle. Expendable components did not need to be built for durability. They needed to be built for single-use reliability and low cost. That thinking influenced everything from rocket stages to missile fairings to modern drop tanks. The concept of deliberate disposability in aerospace engineering traced directly back to Hough's paper tanks over Germany. The pilots who flew with those tanks never forgot them. Veterans of the 8th Air Force wrote memoirs mentioning the paper fuel tanks with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. How could paper carry fuel at 40,000 feet? How could glued kraft paper survive combat damage? How could something so cheap work so perfectly? The answers were all in Hough's engineering. Simple materials, excellent design, rigorous testing, mass production with quality control. Colonel Cass Sheffield Hough died on September 17, 1990. He was 85 years old. The obituaries mentioned his service in World War II, noted his Distinguished Flying Cross, listed his post-war career at Daisy Manufacturing. None of them mentioned paper drop tanks. None of them connected his name to the 5,000 German aircraft destroyed by fighters his tanks had enabled. The story had been forgotten, but the mathematics remained. 412,000 paper tanks produced, $3 million invested, 22 million saved in manufacturing, 400 million saved in prevented bomber losses, 20,000 aircrew lives preserved. The numbers told a story of engineering excellence applied to desperate need. One man saw a problem everyone else considered unsolvable. He found a solution everyone else considered impossible, and he proved them wrong with kraft paper and glue. The experts at Wright Field had declared paper tanks unfeasible. They were correct in theory. Paper should not hold fuel. Paper should not survive at altitude. Paper should not withstand combat damage. But Hough had not asked whether paper should work. He had asked whether paper could work, and he had engineered a solution that answered yes. 15,000 tanks in service before Wright Field finished their evaluation. That single fact summarized Hough's entire approach. Build it, test it, deploy it. Let results speak louder than predictions. The bureaucrats wanted studies. Hough gave them data. They wanted theoretical analysis. He gave them operational success. They said impossible. He showed them 412,000 tanks that worked perfectly. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about engineers who saved lives with paper and glue. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching. And thank you for making sure Colonel Cass Hough doesn't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.